as we and others have been saying, we have temporarily averted a government shutdown, but the shutdown process, the doomsday clock for the next deadline is set for February 8th, and it's worth reflecting on what these shutdowns do to the people who work for a living for the federal government, the people who are in effect the pawns of these power showdowns. And here to talk about that with us now is Paco Fabian. He is the communications director for Good Jobs Nation, and Good Jobs Nation is a movement that represents over 2 million low-wage federal contract workers. So first of all, Paco, thanks for coming on the program.
Hey, pleasure to be here, RJ. Thanks for having me.
So, listen, let's start with this. It must be stressful if you're working for a living and trying to get by, and you keep hearing that you might have no work tomorrow.
Yeah, look, it's really stressful, especially for folks that are already living sort of paycheck to paycheck. You know, folks that are serving members of Congress in their cafeterias, folks that are, you know, cooking and cleaning for them in their buildings and in federal buildings all over Washington, D.C. Unlike actual direct government employees who get furloughed when there's a government shutdown, these workers actually lose their job for, you know, whatever period the government is shut down. I think the last shutdown in 2013 was for 2 weeks, and, you know, workers didn't recover that money. They were out of a job for 2 weeks. And so unlike direct federal employees who get furloughed and then get their money back when the government reopens, these folks are out of luck, if you will.
Yeah, and it's, you know, I don't know too many people at any income level who can do without 2 weeks' pay or even a couple days' pay. And if you're talking about low-wage contract workers, I can see a lot of people who can't buy groceries, who can't pay their rent, who could be out on the street. And it seems to me as if one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, my friend, was because it seems to me that we just don't think about these people enough when we have this kind of brinksmanship we had over the past weekend. It's stressful enough to get by as a low-wage worker in this country and in this city of Washington, D.C., if you have to wonder whether you're going to be able to make it this month when you every time you turn on the news. Even when it gets resolved at the last second, I just can't imagine the stress that people go through.
Yeah, look, it's really difficult, right? I mean, you know, through the Good Jobs Nation campaign, we've been able to highlight stories of Charles Gladden, for example, who worked at the U.S. Senate full time, cooking and cleaning in the cafeteria, but spent his nights on a cardboard mat at the McPherson Metro stop here in Washington, D.C., because he was homeless. He wasn't earning enough to be able to live. Now imagine, not only are you not earning enough, now we're basically going to cut your wages in half for a month, for example, if the government shuts down for 2 weeks. And what are folks supposed to do? I mean, a lot of these folks you know, have to make difficult choices as is, whether we're going to put food on the table for a family or whether we're going to buy, you know, life-saving medicine for our kid who suffers from a medical condition, right? So these are really tough decisions. Some folks do end up paying the ultimate price because they can't afford their medicine. I mean, there was a story of a guy that was trying to do a GoFundMe page, right, for his diabetes medicine. He didn't reach his goal and he died, right? That's the kind of stuff that low-wage workers that rely on the government and federal contractors in particular have to go through. And if you look, for example, at the U.S. Senate cafeteria, again, I'm coming back to this example because there's no other example that shows just how crass sometimes the decisions that are made in that building are, right? These folks serve them every day. They give them their coffee, they give them their lunch, they clean up after them, but they seem to be an afterthought for the lawmakers that take these decisions that result in them losing their wages for an indeterminate amount of time if the government shuts down. And so, it's difficult. I think the whole economy right now for folks that are on the low end is very difficult. The president likes to talk about how he's created more jobs, and the S&P 500 is doing great and it's breaking records every day. But folks at the bottom of the economy aren't seeing that, and it's getting a lot harder for them to be able to make ends meet as is. And now imagine if your wages are cut in half.
That's right, and I guess the other side of this that people may be wondering about, Paco, is most people, when they have a job, they have a boss. The boss has a customer. In this case, the federal government. If the customer, goes out of town or whatever, you still got a job. Your boss still has to pay you. But these contract workers, they don't have the kinds of protections that some other employees have, right? I mean, the boss can just call them up and say, don't come to work tomorrow, and they don't get paid.
Not only that, RJ, but sometimes their boss calls them up and says, hey, the federal government is shut down. We can't pay you, but here are the instructions to go collect unemployment insurance, right? And some of these workers don't even have that protection, right? Look, a lot of these workers are non-union workers. They're not represented at the bargaining table. They don't, have a voice on the job. The rules for federal contractors are really bizarre in some cases. For example, you can't sue your employer if they're stealing your wages, right? You can't. You have to go through the Department of Labor, and the Department of Labor applies this law called the Service Contract Act to determine whether or not your employer is actually stealing your wages. But you don't have, as an individual, a private right of action to try and seek, your stolen wages. And if you look at what the Department of Labor is now, right, its budget has been so cut down that it doesn't really even have the bandwidth to be able to look at these issues, right? So, there's this perpetual sort of cycle that happens where, workers don't have the law on their side. The Department of Labor that's supposed to be looking after them doesn't have the resources to be able to do so. And this is all happening because Republicans, are trying to shrink the government. And if you look, for example, at the first thing that President Trump signed when somebody put legislation in front of him, he signed a repeal of what President Obama had done through executive action, which was the Fair Pay, Safe Workplaces executive order. That was designed to prevent, federal contractors from stealing wages or abusing their workers in any other way by putting, some filters on the federal contracting system. If you've been found to steal wages from your workers, then as the government, we're not going to do business with you because we want our taxpayer dollars to create good jobs, not, keep people in poverty. But the first thing that President Trump did was undo that, right? It was the first. And so, Republicans passed it through the not very often used Congressional Review Act. That was actually the first time that the Congressional Review Act was used. And it was done to hurt workers, right? And so, I think, the president ran as a worker champion, quote unquote, but his record and the record of Republicans on this issue is anything but. And we've seen it, for example, with the Carrier deal that he worked out with a federal contractor, which is Carrier's parent company, United Technologies. He said they were going to keep all these jobs here in the U.S., but those jobs, a couple of weeks ago, there was a layoff of 250 workers in Indianapolis at that Carrier plant. Because they're moving to Mexico, right? Again, jobs that we as taxpayers are funding through federal contracts, we're actually paying companies to ship our jobs overseas or to abuse workers, and that's just not right.
So what's the answer then, Paco, Fabian? Do we do we push? Obviously, we push our elected officials to force better policies through. Obviously, we try to elect better elected officials, but how do we organize these workers? How do we help them organize themselves, is a better way to put it, so that they can stand up for themselves and demand the kind of basic protections and wages they deserve?
Right. Look, I mean, if you look at, across the country, a workplace that has a union or represents its work, or a union represents its workers, has a much lower rate of things like wage theft or other worker abuses. They have a much stronger sort of safety record. Everybody knows what everybody's earning. They understand what the scale is. There is no gender wage gap, for example, in a lot of these places. And so I think that's one of the things we can do, is try and work to make sure that workers have representation at the bargaining table with their employers. Another thing we can do as voters and as taxpayers is really support a change in the way the federal government does business with private companies. Currently, the federal contracting system is set up so that the lowest bidder is the one that gets the contract. Well, the lowest bidder is also the one that's going to cut corners on the backs of workers.
Right.
And that includes wage theft, that includes all kinds of other abuses that workers are suffering. And, in the Democratic platform, there's this sort of model employer concept that has been pushed by progressives and by others. Model employer just simply means, look, if we're going to do business with the federal government, or if the federal government is going to do business with private companies, they need to be model employers. They need to pay living wages. They need to provide benefits. And if their workers decide to join together and bargain collectively, they should let them do it without, using all the tactics that companies sometimes use to make sure that workers don't have a voice on the job.
Well, I think that is very clear to me. It's very simple to me. And if companies don't want to play by those rules, then they can't serve the United States government as their customer. To me, that's a simple enough approach. Now, before I let you go, Paco, Fabian, where can people learn more about what you guys are doing at Good Jobs Nation?
Look, I mean, we have a Facebook page that's pretty active, and we've been putting some really cool stories up. That's facebook.com/goodjobsnation. You can find us pretty easily. We have a website, www.goodjobsnation.org. And yeah, sign up for our list. You can get alerts. We can let you know when the moment is right for you guys to take action, to call your members of Congress when these issues are coming up. And look, as a taxpayer, and assume all the taxpayers want their money to be used for good, not to help abuse workers. And so I urge you guys to check out those web pages. That's www.goodjobsnation.org, and our Facebook page, Good Jobs Nation. You can get a little bit more informed about this, and we'll provide opportunities for you to take action.
All right, brother. Well, thanks for all the good work, and thanks for coming on the program. Again, Paco Fabian is Communications Director for Good Jobs Nation. Paco, good to talk to you.
Thanks, RJ. Appreciate it. Talk to you soon.